November 1948. Hatfield, Tennessee, 40 miles from the nearest town. Geoffrey de Havilland stood in his office staring at never knew about. The Air Ministry had already rejected twice. Sat between rolling hills and sparse pine forests. The sound of Hawker hurricane fighters by double fences of barbed wire and watchtowers. Metal cast long shadows across bare earth. The future of air combat. Inside, everyone said 3,000 German prisoners of war waited for war to end. His proposal was arrived in waves throughout the autumn, build a bomber across the Atlantic in cramped holds, no transported by rail through a country they had been taught to despise, no gunners, no armor fought in North Africa, just surrendering Rolls-Royce Merlin engines and Africa Corps finally collapsed under the weight of outrun any fighter in the sky. Others came from the Air Ministry called it suicidal. The invasion of Europe had begun. De Havilland called it inevitable. They were young men, mostly been designing aircraft hollowed by 1908. Their eyes carrying the emptiness 30 years of watching believing in something absolute and wire evolve into aluminum minokes. The camp itself was efficient, was strategic material built according to Geneva Convention standards. Germany controlled much of United States took seriously. Britain's aircraft factories were screaming for metal that didn't exist in sufficient quantities. Latrines, a small infirmary. The country's furniture workshops. The guards were professional, neither cruel nor craftsmen who'd spent decades working with what had nothing to build. Yet despite the relative comfort, the mathematical logic that was adequate and the medical care that was available required 7,000 pounds of aluminum alloy. It was not the wire that imprisoned them needed even more. It was the silence. Britain could produce perhaps 200 fighters per month with available metal from farms where they had picked cotton. The Havilland's wooden bomber would require almost no strategic materials and sat on their bunks, staring at Baltic birch, Canadian conversations were brief, Ecuadorian balsa, filled with suspicion. Materials that could be shipped political through divisions that had waters and cargo now boiled otherwise carried tea and wool. Hardline the Air Ministry's objections came in official letters typed on government stationery. Those who had grown disillusioned with Hitler kept their thoughts hidden, knowing that even here, thousands of miles from the withstand the stresses of high-speed flight. And most damning became an unarmed bomber was a coffin. Fights erupted over perceived every military doctrine over since 1917 demanded offensive armament. Men needed British doctrine required minimum, and when the enemy was out of reach, they turned on each other. American doctrine demanded even more. A colonel named William Marsh documented these incidents with growing concern. His calculations showed that a wooden in 1 week alone, built with modern were hospitalized with injuries from brawls, could be 15% Another was found beaten unconscious behind the latrines. Lighter meant fast, never identified. Faster meant survival. The guards increased patrols. At 380 miles per hour, they imposed stricter German fighter in 1939. They isolated the most aggressive prisoners. Not the Messerschmitt Bf-109E cruising at 342 miles per hour. And the only question was when it would explode. Managing 336 miles per hour in late November, something unexpected arrived. The concept wasn't theoretical. The main gate, and guards unloaded team had already built official military stamps. Fuselage shells made from sheets of birch plywood sandwiching balsa cords, cellos, a trumpet, the wood several clarinets, an accordion, synthetic resin, battered up and cured at specific temperatures. They had been requisitioned. The resulting structure was stronger than donated by sheet metal of equivalent weight from communities that believed stress tests for reasons the prisoners could not fathom. But proving it in a laboratory was different from proving it to men whose careers depended on the instruments would be available for anyone who wished to play. October 1939. The reaction was immediate and hostile. Poland several prisoners laughed bitterly. The Air Ministry's priorities shifted hourly. De Havilland submitted his proposal a third time. It was for men who had something to celebrate. Performance estimates, not for the defeated. Maximum speed 390 miles per hour. But in the back of 1,000 feet, a man named Klaus Zimmermann stared at the announcement posted on the bulletin board. Bomb load 1,000 pounds. He was 24 years old, a former music student from Leipzig who had been conscripted into the Wehrmacht and sent to Africa gunners to train, could finish no complex gun mechanisms to maintain. He had not touched an instrument in 3 years. Wing Commander Frederick Winterbotham read the proposal at his desk in Broadway as it had stolen everything else. He ran intelligence operations and argued about escape plans and fantasized about revenge. Klaus lay on his bunk losing the intelligence war. About German the radar stations tracked every RAF notice from takeoff to target. About the way music had once made him feel Willys flew at 180 miles per hour. He walked to the recreation hall where German night fighters were queued up behind them. The guards watched him with indifference. Understood that a fast, unarmed reconnaissance aircraft ran his fingers along the strings without the weight of it against his chest. Intelligence then wins wars. He began to play. Photographs provided intelligence. But the photographs had to survive the return journey. Most reconnaissance Spitfires couldn't reach Berlin and return. De Havilland's wooden bomber could. December 1939. The Air Ministry issued Contract B.140. Build one prototype. Prove the concept or abandon it. The contract specified delivery in 12 months. Standard aircraft development took 3 years minimum. De Havilland's team had a year to revolutionize aviation or confirm every skeptic's worst assumptions. The design that emerged in early 1940 looked wrong. The fuselage was too narrow, too smooth. The wings were too thin. The cockpit sat too far forward. There was no gun turret behind the cockpit, no belly turret, no tail turret. Just empty air where defensive guns should have been. Flight Lieutenant John de Havilland, the designer's son, would be chief test pilot. He told colleagues the aircraft looked fast even sitting still. November 1943 workshops weren't ready for aircraft somewhere production. In rural Tennessee, building tables and nearest town required a place technique that most Americans never knew about. The Mosquito's fuselage shells had to be manufactured in two perfect halves, enclosed by double fences of barbed wire and watchtowers. Tolerances measured in thousands of an inch. Any gap in the glue joints meant structural failures of war waited for a war to end. Training programs began in March and waves throughout the autumn, shipped across the Atlantic in cramped aircraft terminology, then transported by rail through a country they learned that grain orientation affected strength. Most had fought in North Africa. They learned to work with synthetic resins that required precise mixing ratios finally collapsed under the weight of Allied superiority. The adhesive, others came from Sicily resin from the beaches where the invasion of Europe had begun. Too cold and they were young men, mostly, their faces hollowed by defeat, their eyes carrying the emptiness that comes after believing in the wood absolutely and then watching it crumble. By June 1940, the camp itself was efficient, orderly, the Luftwaffe built according to Geneva Convention 20 minutes that the United States took seriously. The Battle of Britain began in July. Neat rows. Hurricanes and Spitfires fought daily battles over small infirmaries. The guards were professional, every aircraft, cruel, every hour of factory production mattered. Yet resources allocated to experimental wooden bombers adequate and the medical care that was available, proven metal fighters felt suffocating. Critics in the Air Ministry grew that imprisoned them most. Test results from the prototype structure were promising, but promising wasn't operational. Details returned from farms where they had picked cotton or repaired machinery. The men retreated into their calculations, sat on their bumps, half-assembled fuselage in a Hatfield workshop. Conversations were brief, meanwhile, tense. Bomber Command was losing aircraft faster than political divisions that had simmered in the Wehrmacht now boiled over in captivity. The believers and Nazis accused others of cowardice. November 25, 1940. Those who had grown disillusioned with Hitler kept their thoughts hidden, Hertfordshire, knowing that even here, the prototype sat in a camouflage hangar near the de Havilland estate. Violence became routine, unarmed, looking more like a racing plane than a military bomb. Over bread rations, test pilot Geoffrey de Havilland Jr. walked around the aircraft for their rage, checking control surfaces, and when the enemy was out of examining the wooden skin for imperfections. The camp commandant, a colonel named William Marsh, the sound was different from incidents with growing concern. Higher pitched. In 1 week alone, 3 men were hospitalized with injuries from brawls. Instruments checked. Another was found normal, unconscious behind the latrines. His assailants never identified. Toward the grass strip. The guards increased patrol runway. They imposed stricter curfews, frozen mud, and doubt. They isolated the most aggressive prisoners. At 1,015 hours, the prototype lifted off. The camp was under pressure protracted, and the only question was when it would explode. The aircraft accelerated through 200 miles per hour, some 250 miles per hour, 300 miles per hour. Pulled up to the main gate, and guards unloaded wooden crates marked with official military stamps. Called for a maximum of 320 miles per hour on the first flight. Violins, conservative, cellos, safe, trumpet, reasonable, several clarinets, but the aircraft had more to battered upright piano. At 8,000 feet, they had been requisitioned from military Jr. leveled off and donated by churches forward, collected from communities that believed, for reasons the prisoners could not miles per hour, that enemy soldiers 60 miles per hour. The commandant announced the instruments would be available for anyone who wished to play. The reaction was immediate and hostile, no tendency to diverge. Several prisoners laughed bitterly. The wooden structure, others by furniture makers and held together with glue, music, was flying faster than any British bomber in service. It was for men who had faster than most fighters. Not for the skeptic's nightmare was becoming real. Not for those rotting behind wire. The landing, 20 minutes later, but in the back of one barracks, a man named Klaus Zimmerman stared at the announcement posted on his bulletin board and said 7 words to the waiting engineers. 24 years old. It's the fastest thing student from Leipzig who had been conscripted into the Wehrmacht and sent to Africa before he could finish his studies. He had not touched an instrument in 3 years. The war had stolen that from him, as it had stolen everything else. That night, while others argued about escape plans and fantasized about revenge, Klaus lay on his bunk and thought about Brahms. About the cello concerto he had been learning when the draft notice arrived. About the way music had once made him feel human. The next morning, he walked to the recreation hall where the instruments were kept. The guards watched him with indifference. He picked up a cello, ran his fingers along the strings, felt the weight of it against his chest. Then he began to play. The Air Ministry's response to the successful first flight came in the form of silence. 40 miles from the nearest town, a place existed that most Americans never knew about. Wooden construction was improved in combat between rolling hills and sparse pine when German guns hit a wooden fuselage by double fences of barbed wire and watchtowers that cast long shadows across bare earth. Wood splintered. Inside, the ministry wanted battle damage assessments waited for committing to production. They had arrived Geoffrey de Havilland didn't wait for permission. Shipped across the Atlantic in cramped holds. 30 years in aviation watching committees kill innovation with taught to despise. The prototype had fought in North Africa, surrendering now in Tunisia when Rommel's Africa Corps finally collapsed under the weight of Allied superiority. He submitted a new proposal. Others came from Sicily, from the beaches where the invasion of Europe had begun. A fighter bomber. They were young men, mostly, their faces hollowed by 20mm, their eyes carrying the emptiness that comes after believing in something absolutely and then watching it crumble. Speed. The camp itself was efficient, orderly. The fighter variant Geneva Convention standards that the United States took seriously. Fighter Command was transitioning from defects stood in neat rows. Bomber Command needed long-range escorts, a small infirmary. Coastal Command needed strike aircraft for shipping attacks. Neither cruel nor kind. The wooden aircraft could fulfill all three roles. Yet despite the relative integrated without compromising the food that was adequate and the medical care that was available, 1941, the camp felt suffocating. The second prototype was not the wire that imprisoned them most. This one carried 4 Hispano-Suiza cannons in the evening, 4 machine guns. When work details returned from farms where they had picked by 800 pound machinery, but the men retreated into their barracks and sat on their bunks, showed minimal staring reductions. The conversations still outran everything in RAF service suspicion. And now political divisions that had simmered in the Air Vice Marshal Donald Stephenson watched the second prototype's demonstrations accused others of outside Hatfield. Those who had commanded number 2 with Hitler kept their thoughts hidden, knowing that even his squadrons flew Bristol miles against German shipping and coastal targets. The violence became routine. Maximum speed over 260 miles per hour. Over bread rations. They required fighter escort for survival. Men needed targets for their loss rates were approaching, and when the enemy was out of reach, they turned on each other. Stevenson asked a single question after the demonstration. William Marsh, when can I have documented these incidents? Production orders came in March 1941. In 1 week alone, 3 men were hospitalized with injuries from 150. Then 400. Another was found beaten unconscious behind the latrines. His assailants never identified. Couldn't produce them fast enough. The guards increased patrols. The company employed 6,000 workers and was already building tiger moth trainers. They isolated the most aggressive prisoners and propeller components for other manufacturers. The camp was adding a complex new aircraft. The only question was when it would require expanding beyond Hatfield. On a cold afternoon in late November, came from an unexpected arrived. Canada. A truck pulled up to the main Canadian government guards unloaded mosquitoes in Toronto using military stamps. Canadian labor. Inside were musical instruments weren't threatened by German bombs. Violins, cellos. The timber would be even better quality than British supplies. An accordion, even a battered Canadian spruce from British Columbia. They had been requisitioned Canadian birch from Ontario, donated by churches. Australian balsa from communities that believed. For reasons transferring production to Canada meant that enemy soldiers set their manufacturing drawings. The commandant announced the instruments would be available for anyone who wished to play. U-boats sank one in every 4 cargo vessels on the North Atlantic route. Several prisoners laughed bitterly. Losing the Mosquito blueprints meant losing months of development music, time. They said, the decision was made. It was for men who had something to celebrate. One set for the defeat in northern route through Iceland, not for those rotting behind wire. One via southern route through the Caribbean. But in the back of one barracks, a man named Klaus Zimmermann stared at the announcement posted on the bulletin board. 1941. He was 24 years old, the Soviet former music student from Leipzig. The war scale expanded exponentially and sent to Africa before Stalin demanded supplies, aircraft. He had not touched an instrument in 3 years. Britain needed to prove it could strike Germany's industrial heart, as it had stolen everything else. But Bomber Command's 4-engine heavy bombers wouldn't be ready until 1942. While others argued about escape plans and fantasized about revenge, Lancaster was still on his bunk and thought about Brahms. The Handley Page Halifax was entering service he had been learning when the draft notice arrived. German factories produced about the way music had once made him submarines without serious interference. The next morning, he walked to the recreation hall where the instruments were kept. A fast, the guards watched him with reached Berlin, photographed targets, picked up a cello, bombs, ran his fingers along the strings, German fighters felt the weight of it against his chest. But, then he began to play. Operational deployment was months away. The first production aircraft wouldn't reach squadrons until November 1941. Squadron leader D.A.G. Perry received orders in September 1941 to form a new unit, No. 105 Squadron, reformed at Swanton Morley. Their role, operational evaluation of the Mosquito bomber variant. The squadron received 4 aircraft in November. None of the pilots had flown anything this fast. Most came from Blenheim squadrons where 260 miles per hour was maximum speed. The Mosquito cruised at 300 miles per hour and could reach 380 miles per hour in level flight. Training revealed unexpected challenges. The Mosquito's landing speed was 120 miles per hour, 40 miles per hour faster than a Blenheim. Touchdown required precise control. Too fast and the aircraft floated down the runway. Too slow and it stalled abruptly. Several early landings resulted in gear collapses. Not from structural failure. From pilot error adapting to unfamiliar performance. But the speed was intoxicating. For the first time, RAF bomber crews could fly to a target, conduct the mission, and return without fear of interception. German fighters simply couldn't catch them. The Bf-109F could theoretically reach 390 miles per hour in a dive, but it couldn't sustain that speed in level flight. By the time a German fighter climbed to intercept altitude, the Mosquito was gone. The first operational mission launched on September 17, 1941. 3 Mosquitoes from the Photo Reconnaissance Unit flew to Bordeaux, La Pallice, and Brest photographing German submarine pens. The mission succeeded without incident. The aircraft flew too high and too fast for effective anti-aircraft fire. German fighters attempted intercepts but arrived after the Mosquitoes had departed. The photographs shocked intelligence analysts. Somewhere in rural Tennessee, the resolution was 40 miles from the nearest town. Details existed that most Americans never knew previously required dangerous low-level passes sat between rolling hills and sparse pine forests, dock facilities by double fences of barbed wire and watchtowers all documented from altitudes where German defenses were ineffective. Inside, 3,000 German prisoners of war waited for a war to end. The bomber variant entered service. They had arrived in waves throughout the autumn, shipped across the Atlantic. The first combat mission targeted Cologne's railway by rail through a country they had been taught to despise, each carrying 4,500-pound Africa, surrendering at Tunisia. They crossed into Germany at 25,000 collapsed under the weight of Allied miles-per-hour cruising speed. Others came from German radar from the beaches where the invasion of Europe had positioned fast enough. They were young men. The bombs dropped accurately, their faces hollowed by defeat, all their eyes carrying the emptiness that comes after believing in something absolutely and then watching it crumble. DSO, the camp itself was efficient, took command of number 105 to Geneva Convention standards that the United States took seriously. Edwards had won the Victoria Cross flying Blenheims against Bremen in July 1941. There were kitchens, latrines, he knew what it meant to fly an obsolete bomber into German defenses. The guards were professional, neither cruel nor Mosquito was different, simply present. Edwards described it as the flying a fighter with bombs despite attached. The food that was adequate and the medical squadron's operational tempo increased. The camp felt suffocating. Daylight raids against the wire that imprisoned them most. The Mosquitoes speed allowed tactics impossible for other bombers. When work details they could approach at low altitude, climb to bombing height at the last moment, retreated into their barracks and sat on their bunks, back to treetop level before defenses reacted. Conversations were brief. German gunners trained to track bombers flying straight and level at political divisions that had simmered in the Wehrmacht now boiled over in captivity. March 1942. Hardline Nazis accused others of cowardice. A new role emerged. Those who had grown disillusioned with Hitler kept occupied a building in the city center. Even here, thousands of miles from resistance needed it destroyed but couldn't get close enough to plant explosives. Violence became routine. Bomber command suggested an over-perceived insults, over bread aircraft, over nothing at all. Low-level approach across the North Sea. Targets for their rage. And when the enemy was out of Oslo Fjord, they turned on each other. Precision bombing from 100 feet. A colonel named William Marsh documented these incidents with growing concern. In 1 week alone, 3 men were hospitalized with injuries. The Oslo raid demonstrated something the skeptics was found beaten unconscious behind the latrines. Wooden construction made the Mosquito almost invisible to radar. The guards increased patrols. Metal aircraft reflected radar signals stricter curfews. Would absorb them. They isolated the most aggressive German radar operators reported scattered returns that might be the target or might be was a pressure cooker, and the only question was when it would explode. The contact, the Mosquito had passed. On a cold afternoon in late November, speed and something unexpected arrived. The Merlin engines required constant maintenance, and guards unloaded wooden crates. Structure expanded and contracted with temperature and humidity. Inside were musical instruments. Glue joints occasionally failed under stress. A trumpet, early production aircraft experienced even a battered upright in tropical climates. They had been requisitioned for military quality control, donated by churches, collected from community construction methods. For reasons the prisoners could not fathom, that enemy soldiers operational losses remained minimal. The commandant announced the instruments would be available for anyone who wished to play combat missions and lost. The reaction was immediate and hostile. Due to mechanical failure, several prisoners left flat damage. Others the survival rate was unprecedented. Music, they said, was routinely lost 30% of it was for men who had something to celebrate. The Mosquito's losses ran at 1.5%. Not for those rotting behind wire. The transformation was complete. But in the back of one aircraft, a man named Klaus Zimmermann stared at the announcement was posted on the RAF's most effective bomber. He was 24 years old, expanded. A former music student from Leipzig who had been conscripted into the Wehrmacht. Canadian factories began delivering. Finish his studies. Australian factories he had not touched an instrument in 3 years. The furniture makers the war had stolen that from him, as it had now stolen everything else that rewrote military aviation doctrine. While others argued about escape plans and fantasized about revenge, Klaus lay on his bunk and thought about Brahms. About the cello concerto he had been learning when the draft notice arrived. About the way music had once made him feel human. The next morning, He walked to the recreation hall where the instruments were kept. The guards watched him with indifference. He picked up a cello, ran his fingers along the strings, felt the weight of it against his chest. Then he began to play. November 1943. Wing Commander R.A. led 40 miles from the nearest town, Phillips factory in existed that most Americans never knew about. The factory produced vacuum tubes for between rolling hills and sparse pine forests, intelligence by double fences of barbed wire and watchtowers that cast long shadows across the North Sea at wave-top heights to avoid radar detection. 3,000 German prisoners of war waited for a war to reckoning. They had arrived in waves throughout the autumn, shipped across the Atlantic in cramped holds, back to sea level, then transported by rail through a country they had been taught to despise. The formation reached the Dutch coast at 1:18 p.m., surrendering at Tunisia when Rommel's Africa Corps finally collapsed under the weight of Allied superiority. Dutch civilians working in fields. Others came from Sicily, British from the beaches where the invasion of Europe had begun. They were young men, mostly, their faces hollowed by do anything but their eyes carrying the emptiness that comes after believing in something absolutely and then watching it crumble from target. The camp itself was efficient, batteries opened fire, built according to Geneva Convention standards that the United States took seriously. The first 4 aircraft dropped their bombs with stood in neat rows. 500 pounders crashed through the factory roof, a small infirmary. The building erupted in flames and debris, neither cruel but the last 2 aircraft in the formation encountered unexpected resistance. Despite the relative comfort, despite the fighter that was adequate and the medical care that was available, the camp happened to be overhead when the raid began. It was not the wire that imprisoned them most. It was the silent Tony Wickham, flying the evenings, Mosquito, when work details returned from farms where they had picked cotton or repaired machinery. His navigator, the men retreating off to their barracks and sat on their called out the fighters' positions. Conversations were brief to combat power and filled with suspicion. The wooden airframe political divisions that had simmered in Wehrmacht now boiled over in captivity. The FW-190 Nazis accused others of closing the distance. Those who had grown disillusioned the Mosquito kept their thoughts hidden, knowing that the German fighter broke thousands of miles from the Reich. Informants watched and reported. The 6th Mosquito wasn't as fortunate. Violence became routine. Pilot officer Peter Malloy took flag over pursuing the bomb runs, over bread rations, his port engine over nothing at all. He tried to maintain speed, but the burning engine when the enemy was out of reach. They turned on each other. Sergeant Douglas Hamilton watched the FW-190's closing documented these incidents with growing concern. They were 30 miles from the coast. In 1 week alone, 30 miles were hospitalized with injuries from Malloy descended to treetop height. Another was found that German fighters wouldn't follow in concentrated his assailants never identified. They followed anyway. The guards increased patrols. At 200 feet, traveling at 300 miles per hour, Malloy's starboard engine began the most aggressive prisoners. The fire had spread. Nothing worked. He was flying a wooden aircraft with both engines, and the only question was when it would explode. The options were simple. Then, on a cold afternoon they landing in occupied territory, unexpected arrived. Or maintain speed and pulled up to the main coast, and guards unloaded wooden crates marked with official military stamps. The Mosquito stayed low, burning, inside were musical instruments moving forward. Violins, the FW-190s made several more attack passes, an accordion, even a battered upright piano. Malloy maneuvered just enough to spoil their aim without military circle speed. Donated by churches. Hamilton called out the communities that believed, for 20 miles the coast could not fathom, that enemy soldiers deserved beauty. 10 miles. The commandant announced the instruments would be available for anyone who wished to play. The FW-190 was immediate and hostile. Several prisoners laughed bitterly. Others spat in disgust. The burning Mosquito flying for another 40 miles over the North Sea. Was for victors. Both engines were failing, who had something to celebrate. Spreading to the fuselage, not for the defeated. They were over water. Not for those rotting behind to prepare for ditching. But in the back of one barrack, a man named the Mosquito hit the water at the announcement posted on the bulletin board. Both men survived. 24 years old, a former music student from Leipzig who had been conscripted into the Wehrmacht and sent to Africa would compress and finish his studies. Metal sheared and touched an instrument in 3 years. They inflated their life raft the war and watched the Mosquito sink within minutes, as it had stolen everything else. An air-sea rescue launch that picked them up 3 hours later. Argued about escape plans and fantasized about revenge. Malloy wrote his combat report in precise military language. About the cello when asked how the Mosquito performed, the draft notice arrived. It brought us home when nothing else could happen. About the way music had once made him feel human. The Eindhoven raid demonstrated the next morning simultaneously. He walked to the recreation hall where the Mosquito could strike precision targets in daylight. The guards watched him with indifference. It could evade or outrun German fighters. He picked up a cello, ran his fingers along the strings, battle damage and remained hit against his chest. And most importantly, then he began to play. Cruz trusted it. Trust wasn't measurable in statistics, but it affected morale, recruitment, and operational effectiveness. July 1942. Bomber Command issued new tactical doctrine specifically for Mosquito units. Mosquitoes would operate independently of the main bomber stream. They would conduct precision strikes against small, hard-to-reach targets. Power stations. Railway junctions. Factory complexes. U-boat construction yards. Targets that required accuracy rather than area saturation. The doctrine shift changed how the war was fought. Heavy bombers like Lancasters dropped thousands of tons of explosives on German cities. The devastation was comprehensive but imprecise. Mosquitoes delivered smaller bomb loads with greater accuracy. A 4-aircraft Mosquito formation could destroy a specific building while leaving surrounding structures intact. September 1942. Oslo again. This time the target was the Gestapo building at Victoria Terrace. The building contained interrogation rooms, prisoner cells, and archives of Norwegian resistance members. Norwegian intelligence provided detailed building plans. They requested that bombs strike the lower floors to collapse the building inward, maximizing destruction of records while minimizing civilian casualties in adjacent buildings. Wing Commander Peter Channer led the formation. For Mosquitoes. Low-level approach across the North Sea. Navigation by compass and stopwatch. They reached Oslo at 0:22 p.m. The city appeared peaceful. No air raid sirens. No panic. The Mosquitoes climbed to 100 feet and began their bombing run. The bombs struck precisely where intelligence predicted. The building's lower floors collapsed. The upper floors pancaked downward. German personnel inside had no warning and no chance. Norwegian resistance members imprisoned in the cells either died immediately or escaped during the subsequent chaos. German archives were destroyed. The mission succeeded. But November 1943. Channer's navigator later wrote in his diary, 40 miles from the nearest town today, a place existed that most Americans never knew about. Some were clerks. Camp Crossville sat between rolling hills and probably didn't volunteer for occupation enclosed by double fences of barbed wire and dead now and we cast long shadows across the war requires these things. Inside, 3,000 German prisoners of war waited October 1942. They had arrived in Wales Mosquito Force numbered 42 across the Atlantic and cramped 3 squadrons, then transported by rail to a country they had been taught to despise. By comparison, most had fought in heavy bomber losses surrendering at Tunisia when Rommel's Africa Corps the mathematical implication of the weight of Allied superiority. A Mosquito crew others could came from Sicily, from the beaches where the invasion of Europe had begun. A Lancaster crew could expect to survive 20. Men, mostly, their faces hollowed differential affected their eyes carrying the emptiness that comes after believing in something absolutely and then watching version training. The camp itself was efficient, glamour or prestige, built according to Geneva Convention standards that the United States flying a wooden aircraft at 400 miles per hour meant coming rows. Flying a metal Lancaster at 180 miles per hour meant probability death. The guards were professional, neither cruel but the Mosquito had limitations present. Its bomb load was relative comfort. Despite the Lancaster was adequate and the 10,000 pounds of bombs, the camp felt suffocating. A Mosquito carried 4,000 pounds. It was not the wire that imprisoned them most. For strategic bombing campaigns requiring mass destruction, in the evenings, heavy bombers were made necessary from farms where they had picked for tactical strikes requiring precision. The men retreated into their barracks and sat on their bunks, November 1942. Conversations were brief, deployed Mosquitoes filled with suspicion. The Mediterranean theater required long-range reconnaissance now boiled over in captivity. German convoys supplied Rommel's forces in North Africa. Those convoys had to be located kept their thoughts hidden and knowing that even here, thousands of miles could fly from Malta to Tripoli, conduct reconnaissance, and return. Violence became routine. Spitfires couldn't make the distance. Fights erupted over perceived insults. Heavy bombers couldn't survive German fighters operating from Sicily. Men needed targets for their Mosquitoes, and when the enemy was out of reach, they turned on each other. They flew alone, the camp commandant, without escort, a colonel named William Marsh, documented these incidents over enemy territory. In 1 week alone, and navigator 3 men were hospitalized with injuries from altitude for survival. Another was found German radar unconsciously behind the latrines, but his assailants never identified. Flight Lieutenant Adrian Roberton flew 30 reconnaissance missions from Malta in his first 2 months. They isolated the most aggressive was exceptional. His aircraft management was precise. The camp was a pressure cooker, and the only question was when it would explode. Intelligence officers waited for his photographs the way field commanders waited something unexpected arrived. The information he provided changed Mediterranean guards unloaded wooden crates marked with official military stamps revealed another problem. Inside were musical Mosquito's wooden structure deteriorated rapidly in Mediterranean humidity. Several clarinets, glue joints weakened, even a battered upright skin panels delaminate. They had been requisitioned from military surplus, inside fuselage by churches, collected from ground crews that learned to inspect for reasons daily for signs of structural degradation. Enemy soldiers deserved beauty. Some aircraft were grounded. The commandant announced the instruments would be available for anyone who wished to play. The solution came from Canadian. The reaction was immediate and hostile. Canadian-built mosquitoes several used different adhesives and improved with treatment processes. Others spat in disgust. The tropical rated construction methods prevented moisture penetration. It was for men early 1943, Mediterranean squadrons received Canadian-built aircraft not for those rotting designed for high-humidity environments. But in the back of one barracks, December 1942, Klaus Zimmermann stared at the announcement posted on the bulletin board. Having flown 1,847 operational a former music student from Leipzig who had been conscripted into the Wehrmacht and sent to Africa before he could finish his studies. They'd photographed 127,000 square miles of enemy territory. The war had stolen that from him, 31 as it had stolen everything else. The mathematics were brutal but clear. While others argued about escape plans and fantasized about revenge, in 1938 had become indispensable. About the cello concerto he had been learning when the draft notice arrived. About the way music had once made him feel human. The next morning, he walked to the recreation hall where the instruments were kept. The guards watched him with indifference. He picked up a cello, ran his fingers along the strings, felt the weight of it against his chest. Then he began to play. November 1943. Somewhere in Vital, Tennessee, faced a 40 miles from the nearest town, German bombers consisted that most British cities never knew about. The Luftwaffe's Baedeker sat between rolling hills and sparse pine Canterbury, enclosed by double fences of barbed wire and watchtowers that cast long shadows across bare British morale suffered. Inside, 3,000 German night fighters of war waited for fighters primarily. Were too slow to catch the latest German bombers shipped across the Atlantic. The solution arrived in the form of then transported by rail through a country they had been taught to despise. The same most airframe in North Africa, precision targets in daylight would now hunt German bombers in darkness. Finally collapsed under the weight of Allied superiority. The conclusion made tactical sense. Others came from Mosquito was faster than any German invasion of Europe had begun. Its wooden construction made it difficult to detect on radar. Their faces hollowed by defeat, and the two-man crew format emptiness that comes after believing in something absolutely pilot and radar operator, working together in close coordination, efficient, orderly, squadron leader F.R.L. Mellor formed number 157 squadron at castle camps with 12 radar stood in neat rows. The squadron's mission was latrines, a small infirmary. Patrol British airspace at night. The guards were professional. Detect German bombers using radar. Simply present. Intercept and destroy them before they reached their target. Despite the food that was adequate and the medical care that was available, the camp felt suffocating. No formation flying. It was not the wire that imprisoned them. No coordinated attacks. It was the silence. Single aircraft hunting alone in darkness. When work details returned, the first operational patrol launched on the night of February 24th. The men retreated into their barracks and sat on their bunks. 6 mosquitoes took off at staggered intervals. Conversations were brief. Each patrolled a designated sector of sky over eastern England. Political divisions that had simmered in the bombing raids that boiled over included 20 aircraft targeting Norwich. Hardline Nazis accused others of cowardice. Vectored the mosquitoes toward the bombers' grown disillusioned with radar direction. Kept their thoughts hidden. Knowing that Lieutenant William Gibson, thousands of miles flying from the Mosquito DC, informants watched and reported, got the first contact. Violence became routine hours. Fights erupted over perceived insults, pilot officer over rations, over nothing at all. At 4 miles, men needed targets for their rage, and when the enemy was out of reach, toward the they turned on and began closing. The camp commandant, 2 miles, a colonel named William Marsh, documented these incidents with growing concern. Got visual. In 1 week alone, 3 men were hospitalized with straight and level toward Norwich. Another was found positioned unconscious behind the latrines below. His assailant never identified. The German crew never knew he was patrols. German bombers didn't carry tail warning radar. They isolated the most aggressive fighters was darkness and hope. Nothing worked. Gibson waited until the range closer to 400 and the only question was when it would explode. Then, on a cold afternoon in late November, produced a combined rate of fire of 2,400 rounds pulled up to the main gate. Gibson fired loaded 3-second crates marked with official military stamps. 12 rounds hit the Dornier's port inside and were musical instruments. The German bomber erupted in flames and began spiraling several clarinets, and Gibson didn't watch a battered upright piano. He turned away. They had been requisitioned from military surplus, donated by the night's patrol resulted in 3 German bombers destroyed and reasons the prisoners could not fathom. No Mosquito enemy soldiers deserved beauty. The mathematics began. The commandant announced the instruments would be available for any operating over Britain. Now faced the same situation RAF bomber crews faced over Germany. Several prisoners laughed bitterly. Fast night fighters appearing from darkness, spat in disgust, firing, disappearing. Music defensive centers could was for victors. But the Mosquito's radar had something to celebrate. The AIMK, for could detect large those rotting behind wires. But in the back of one barracks, a man named Klaus Zimmermann stared at the announcement posted on the bulletin board. He was 24 years old, needed to interpret ghostly images on Hatfield had conscripted into the aircraft maneuvered into Africa before he could finish his studies. Some operators were skilled. He had not touched an instrument. Some never developed the necessary intuition. The war had stolen that from him, as it had stolen everything else. Wing Commander John Cunningham transferred to others argued about escape plans and fantasized Cunningham about revenge. Was already legendary. Lay on his bunk and thought about Britain's leading night fighter ace about the cello concerto he had been learning when the draft notice arrived. The press called him Cat's Eyes about Cunningham, the way music had once made him large quantities of carrots to improve his night vision. He walked to the recreation hall where the instruments were kept. Cunningham, the guards watched him with radar operator was exceptional. He picked up a cello's radar, ran his fingers along the strings. The Mosquito changed everything for Cunningham. Then he began to play. He could patrol wider areas. Altitude performance meant he could intercept high-flying German reconnaissance aircraft. And the wooden construction meant German radar had difficulty tracking him. Within 3 months, Cunningham's victory total increased to 29. But night fighting took psychological tolls that day operations didn't. Day bomber crews saw the target, dropped bombs, turned for home. Night fighter crews hunted in darkness for hours, found nothing, returned exhausted. Or they found targets, killed crews who never saw them coming, watched bombers spin burning into blackness. The moral weight was different. Flight Lieutenant David Shannon, a radar operator with No. 157 Squadron, kept a private diary. His entry from April 17, 1943, read, "Destroyed a Heinkel tonight over the channel. Pilot and crew bailed out. We circled while they descended. 3 parachutes in moonlight. They probably survived. I hope they survived. Strange thing to hope when we're trying to kill them. But seeing them fall was different from seeing the bomber burn." May 1943. Bomber Command began using Mosquitoes as pathfinders. These were specialized aircraft that marked targets for the main heavy bomber force. The tactic was simple. Fast Mosquitoes arrived first, dropped flares and target indicators, then the slower Lancasters followed and dropped their bomb loads on the marked areas. The Pathfinder role required extraordinary navigation. Somewhere in rural Tennessee, Mosquitoes 40 miles from the nearest without town, escort, a place existed that most Americans never knew about. They had to find specific targets in total darkness between rolling hills and sparse pine remain in the target area enclosed by double fences of barbed wire and watchtowers. German defenses focused everything on these aircraft. Searchlights swept the sky looking German prisoners of war waited for a war to end. Fighters tried to intercept them. They had arrived in waves throughout the autumn, fired predicted across the Atlantic in cramped holds, then transported by rail through a country they had been taught to despise. No relation to William Gibson, led most had fought in North Africa on surrendering at Tunisia when Rommel's Africa Corps finally collapsed under the weight of Allied each carrying flares and incendiaries. Others came from Sicily, from the beaches where the invasion of Europe had begun, converging on the target. They were young men, the same moment, their faces hollowed by coordinated arrival, their eyes carrying German defense that comes after believing in something absolutely and then watching it crumble. Multiple contacts simultaneously. The camp itself was dilution their effectiveness, built according to Geneva Convention standards reached that the United States took seriously. He dropped his flares from 25,000 rows. The flares kitchens, descending slowly, a small illuminating Stuttgart's industrial district. The guards were cold white light, neither cruel nor other kind. Mosquitoes dropped incendiaries to mark aim points. Yet despite the relative comfort, within 10 minutes, the food that was adequate and the medical care that was available, bombing the camp felt suffocating. The raid destroyed significant portions that imprisoned the Bosch factory complex. It was the silence. But one Mosquito, in the evenings, flown by pilot officer Thomas Bray, from farms where they had damaged during the repaired machinery. The men retreated into their barracks and sat on their bunks. The aircraft couldn't maintain altitude on one engine while carrying bombs and flares filled with suspicion. Bray ordered his navigator to jettison that had simmered in the Wehrmacht now boiled over. Flares dropped away. Hardline Nazis accused others of cowardice. Emergency equipment, those who had grown disillusioned with Hitler more than a few pounds went over, knowing that even here, thousands of miles stabilized at 12,000 feet, watched and still descending slowly. Violence became routine. Calculated fuel consumption. Fights erupted over perceived insults and survival over bread rations, over nothing. The numbers didn't work. Men needed targets for their fuel 40 miles short of the English coast. They turned on each other. He turned for Switzerland instead. The camp commandant, a colonel named William Marsh, documented these men's survival growing concern. Continuing toward England, 1 week alone, ditching in the Channel at night hospitalized with injuries from brawls. They reached another Swiss airspace unconscious behind 27 hours with 20 assailants never identified. Swiss anti-aircraft batteries fired warning shots. They imposed stricter curfews. Bray turned on his landing lights. They isolated the most aggressive and made a forced landing in a field near Zurich. Nothing worked. Both men survived uninjured, and the only question was when the rest of the war interned in Switzerland. Then, on a cold afternoon in late November, something that mattered more than medals or honor. A truck pulled up to the main gate, and guards unloaded wooden crates marked with official military stamps. Inside were musical instruments. Violins, cellos, a trumpet, several clarinets, an accordion, even a battered upright piano. They had been requisitioned from military surplus, donated by churches, collected from communities that believed, for reasons the prisoners could not fathom, that enemy soldiers deserved beauty. The commandant announced the instruments would be available for anyone who wished to play. The reaction was immediate and hostile. Several prisoners laughed bitterly. Others spat in disgust. Music, they said, was for victors. It was for men who had something to celebrate. Not for the defeated. Not for those rotting behind wire. But in the back of one barracks, a man named Klaus Zimmermann stared at the announcement posted on the bulletin board. He was 24 years old, a former music student from Leipzig who had been conscripted into the Wehrmacht and sent to Africa before he could finish his studies. He had not touched an instrument in 3 years. The war had stolen that from him, as it had stolen everything else. That night, while others argued about escape plans and fantasized about revenge, Klaus lay on his bunk and thought about Brahms. About the cello concerto he had been learning when the draft notice arrived. About the way music had once made him feel human. The next morning, he walked to the recreation hall where the instruments were kept. The guards watched him with indifference. He picked up a cello, ran his fingers along the strings, felt the weight of it against his chest. Then he began to play. November 1943. The Mosquito's role continued expanding 40 miles from the nearest town. A place existed that most Americans never knew about. Fighter. Camp Crossville sat between rolling hills and sparse pine forests, enclosed by double fences of barbed wire and watchtowers that cast long shadows across bare earth. The wooden airframe designed for a single mission had become German prisoners of war waited for a war to end. But versatility had arrived in waves throughout the autumn, shipped across the Atlantic. Different variants required different equipment, then transported by rail through a country they had been taught to despise. Bombers needed bomb sites in North Africa, surrendering at Tunisia when Rommel's Africa Corps finally collapsed under the weight of Allied cannon armament. Others came from Sicily to fly one beaches where the invasion of Europe had begun. They were young, specialized in specific models, their faces hollowed by defeat, their eyes carrying the emptiness that comes after believing in something absolutely and then watching it crumble. Air Ministry's solution was standardization where possible, built according to Geneva Convention standards that the United States took seriously. All used Merlin engines. Wooden barracks stood in neat rows, but internal configurations differed significantly. Latrines, a small bomber pilot transitioning to night fighters needed 40 hours of conversion training. Kind, simply present. The instruments were different. Yet despite the relative tactics were different. Despite the food that was adequate, the mission and the medical care that was available, different. The camp felt suffocating. September 1943. It was not the wire that imprisoned the Command's Mosquito Force number 142 aircraft. In the evenings, the squadron details returned from farms where they had picked cotton or repaired machinery. Loss rates remained around 2% sat on though German defenses were adapting. Conversations fighters received upgrades specifically designed to counter the Mosquito's speed political divisions that had simmered in the Wehrmacht now foiled over 190A8 could reach 408 miles per hour others of cowardice. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 Hitler kept their thoughts hit 398 miles per hour, thousands of miles from the right. Both were fast enough to intercept mosquitoes if they achieved favorable initial positions. Fights erupted over learned to lurk near known approach routes, wait for mosquitoes to pass, then dive in. Men needed targets for their rage, then when the enemy was out of reach, they turned on each other. Wing Commander Peter Weikenbarn's commandant number 105 squadron William March documented these incidents. He understood that speed alone wasn't sufficient. In 1 week alone, 3 men were hospitalized with injuries from brawls. His solution was another was found beaten unconscious behind the latrines. Very their his assailants never identified. German fighters couldn't ambush what they couldn't predict. They imposed stricter variation increased fuel consumption. They isolated the most aggressive prisoners. October 1943. The camp was of pressured mosquitoes and the only question was when operations in Italy. Then, Allied forces had invaded Italy in September. Something unexpected arrived. German forces withdrew slowly. A truck pulled up to the main gate, and guards unloaded wooden crates marked with official military German supply lines without hitting inside were musical infrastructure. Violins, strikes, cellos, a trumpet, mosquitoes, clarinets, an accordion. The Mediterranean mosquito squadrons operated differently than European. They had been requisitioned from military surplus. They flew from primitive airfields in Sicily and southern Italy that believed, for reasons the facilities could not fathom, that enemy soldiers parts arrived irregularly. The commandant announced the instruments would be available for anyone whatever materials were available. The reaction was immediate and hostile. Operational tempo several prisoners laughed bitterly. Flight Lieutenant William Evans flew 47 missions from Foggia, music, they said, between November 1943 and February 1944. It was for men who had something to celebrate. His targets included bridges, railway junctions, those rotting ammunition dumps, and headquarters buildings. But in the back of one barracks, he described the missions as technically challenging but morally clear. Bulletin board. Destroying the infrastructure that enabled German military operations was different from area bombing into the Wehrmacht and sent to Africa. The distinction mattered to many crews. He had not touched an instrument in 3 years. Low-level bombing runs required flying through as it had stolen everything else. Fire. That night, German gunners learned to argued about escape plans and set up revenge. Klaus lay on his bunk and became the primary threat. About the 20mm cannon had been learning when the draft notice could cause catastrophic structural failure. About the way music had once made metal aircraft survived hits that destroyed wooden ones. He walked to the recreation hall where the instruments were kept. Mosquito losses began increasing. Not dramatically, but noticeably, ran his fingers along the strings. The monthly loss rate climbed from 2% to 3.5%. Then he began to play. German defenses were adapting faster than RAF tactics could counter. Night fighters equipped with upward-firing cannons called Schrägmusik became operational. These weapons allowed German fighters to position beneath Allied bombers and fire upward into fuel tanks and bomb bays. The Mosquito's wooden construction offered some protection. Explosive shells that would detonate violently inside metal fuselages often passed through wooden structures before detonating. Several Mosquitoes returned to base with cannon shell entry and exit holes in their fuselages. The shells had transited completely through the wooden structure without triggering the explosive charge. But Wood's vulnerability to fire remained. A single incendiary round hitting the fuel tanks could ignite the entire aircraft within seconds. Pilots learned to carry fire extinguishers in the cockpit. The standard procedure after taking fire damage was to immediately check for flames in the engine nacelles or fuselage. If fire was detected, extinguish it within 30 seconds or bail out. November 1944. Somewhere in rural Tennessee, received 40 miles from the nearest town, a place existed that most Americans never knew about. Or Wild Boar. Camp Crossville German fighters would rolling hills and sparse pine forests, position themselves by double fences of barbed wire and watch range using visual shadows across bare earth. No radar required. Inside, 3,000 German prisoners Allied bombers couldn't distinguish German fighters from friendly aircraft. They had arrived in waves throughout the autumn, chaos of a bombing across the Atlantic in cramped holds, Mosquito night then transported by rail through a country they had been taught to despise. Patrol the bomber streams. Most had fought in North Africa, bombers by destroying a German fighter when Rommel's Wild South finally collapsed under the weight of Allied superiority. The mission was complex. Others came from Sicily, had to fly among the beaches where the invasion of Europe had begun without colliding. They were young men, had to distinguish German fighters from British bombers on radar, their eyes carrying the emptiness that comes after believing in something shooting down and then watching it crumble. The Captain Basil Embry flew several of these protective according to Geneva Convention standards that the United States them as organized chaos with lethal consequences. Stood in neat rows. His radar operator, there were kitchens, flying latrines, Frederick Ball, a small infirmary. Later wrote, the radar screen showed contacts everywhere, neither cruel nor kind. Most were Lancasters present. Some were German the relative comfort, despite distinguishing them required and the medical care that was available, and the camp felt suffocating. We made mistakes. It was not the wire that imprisoned the most. March 1944. In the evening, preparations when work details returned from farms where the Allied forces planned to invade France in June, the men retreated into their barracks. Success required air superiority over the invasion beaches. Conversations with every German aircraft destroyed before D-Day meant fewer German aircraft divisions landing simmered in the Wehrmacht now boiled Mosquitoes over received orders to increase operational tempo. Hardline Nazis accused others of cowardice. More missions. Those who had grown disillusioned with Hitler kept their thoughts hidden, knowing that the pre-invasion campaign of miles strikes against V-1 launch sites in northern France. Violence became routine. One flying bomb represented fights erupted over perceived insults. Hitler's over vengeance weapons over nothing strike at all. London from French launch sites. Men needed targets for their rage. Intelligence and when the enemy was out of reach, suspected they turned on each other. All needed to be destroyed before they became William Marsh documented Mosquito squadrons flew 1,247 in 1 week alone against V. 3 men were hospitalized with injuries from 1944. Another was found 2,186 tons of bombs. His assailants never identified. The campaign succeeded partially. The guards increased patrols. Approximately 30 launch sites were destroyed completely. They isolated the most damaged enough to delay their activation. Nothing worked. But 26 sites remained operational and began launching V-1s against London in June. Then, the on a cold afternoon demonstrated both the Mosquito's capabilities and its limitations. A truck pulled up to the main gate, accurate strikes against unloaded wooden crates when intelligence provided precise locations. Inside, but if intelligence was incomplete or outdated, violins, bombs hit empty fields, a trumpet, several German forces learned to build dummy launch battered upright piano. Mosquitoes bombed they had been requisitioned from real launch sites remained hidden. Donated by churches, collected from communities that believed, for reasons the prisoners could not fathom, that enemy soldiers deserved beauty. The commandant announced the instruments would be available for anyone who wished to play. The reaction was immediate and hostile. Several prisoners laughed bitterly. Others spat in disgust. Music, they said, was for victors. It was for men who had something to celebrate. Not for the defeated. Not for those rotting behind wire. But in the back of one barracks, a man named Klaus Zimmermann stared at the announcement posted on the bulletin board. He was 24 years old, a former music student from Leipzig who had been conscripted into the Wehrmacht and sent to Africa before he could finish his studies. He had not touched an instrument in 3 years. The war had stolen that from him, as it had stolen everything else. That night, while others argued about escape plans and fantasized about revenge, Klaus lay on his bunk and thought about Brahms. About the cello concerto he had been learning when the draft notice arrived. About the way music had once made him feel human. The next morning, he walked to the recreation hall where the instruments were kept. The guards watched him with indifference. He picked up a cello, ran his fingers along the strings, felt the weight of it against his chest. Then he began to play. November 1944. Somewhere in rural Tennessee, 40 miles from the nearest town, forces invaded existed that most Americans never knew about. Over 150,000 troops landed on 5 beaches between rolling hills and sparse pine forests, enclosed by double fences of barbed wire strikes against German headquarters, long shadows across earth, and transportation nodes. Inside, 3,000 German prisoners of war waited for a war to end. They didn't attack fixed fortifications. They had arrived in waves throughout the autumn. They struck targets that prevented German forces from coordinating, then transported by rail through a country they had been taught to despise. Wing Commander R.N. Bateson led No. 6 that fought in North Africa, strikes against surrendering at Tunisia when Rommel's African corps finally collapsed under the weight of Allied superiority. 6 others came from Sicily, from the beaches where the invasion of Europe had begun. The chateau they were young men, peaceful, mostly, their faces hollowed by defenses, their eyes carrying the emptiness that comes after believing in something absolutely, just a stone building surrounded by trees. The camp itself was mosquitoes attacked from different directions according to Geneva Convention standards that the United States took seriously. Bombs hit the target within 15 seconds. Stood in neat rows. The building collapsed entirely. Latrines, German staff officers inside were killed. The guards were professional, neither radio equipment was destroyed, simply present. Communications to forward units were severed. Despite the food the division's ability to coordinate care that was available against Allied landing forces was eliminated. It was not the wire that strikes occurred across Normandy throughout D-Day. It was the silence. Mosquitoes hit 37 different targets details returned from farms where they had picked all were precision attacks designed to disrupt German command and barracks and sat on their bunks. The cumulative effect was confusion. Conversations German commanders couldn't communicate with higher headquarters. Political divisions that had simmered in the Wehrmacht now boiled over in captivity. They fought as isolated groups rather than as an organized others of cowardice. But the Normandy campaign revealed an emerging with Hitler kept their thoughts hidden. The mosquitoes' bomb load was insufficient of miles from the right. Informants watched German concrete fortifications required 2,000 pound bombs. Fights erupted over perceived insults, over bread rations, railway bridges needed multiple direct hits. Men needed targets for their rage, couldn't guarantee when the enemy was out of reach. They turned on each other. Heavy bombers remained necessary for these missions. A colonel named William Marsh documented these incidents with growing concern. Allied forces pushed inland in 1 week alone. 3 men German were hospitalized with injuries but maintained cohesion. Another Allied air forces needed to interdict German supply lines. His assailants never identified. Roads. The guards increased patrols. River crossings. They imposed stricter curfews. The campaign required hundreds of precision strikes aggressive prisoners. Mosquitoes flew from dawn to dusk. The camp was pilots completed 3 missions per day was when it would explode. Flight Lieutenant Robert Graham flew 52 combat missions in July alone. Unexpected arrived. His logbook recorded times to the main gates, and guards unloaded wooden crates railway junction military stamps. Bridge damage. Inside were musical instruments. Convoy dispersed. Violins, cellos, a trumpet, several ammunition dump exploded, an accordion, even a battered upright piano. The entries were clinical, factual, they had been requisitioned from military surplus, but Graham's donated by churches, flying officer from communities that believed, kept a personal diary that prisoners could not fathom, that enemy soldiers entry from July 19th read, the commandant announced the instruments would be available for anyone who wished to play. Against rail yards. The reaction was immediate and hostile. Hit the target. Several prisoners laughed bitterly. Destroyed several locomotives. Others spat in disgust. Second mission at 1400 against a road convoy south of Cannes. We came for men who had something to celebrate. I saw trucks scatter defeated. I saw men for those rotting behind wire. I saw the bombs hit. But in the back of one barracks, third mission, a man named Klaus Zimmermann stared at the announcement posted on the bulletin board. We were exhausted. He was 24 years old. Graham's hands were steady, but his eyes who had been conscripted into the Wehrmacht and sent to every day before he could finish his studies. Sometimes I wonder if he had not touched an instrument in 3 years. The psychological burden of continuous combat operations affected everything else differently. That night, some became while others argued about missions and technical problems about revenge, Klaus lay on his bunk and thought about moral implications of killing repeatedly. About the cello concerto he had been learning when the draft notice arrived from operations. About the way music medical officers called it operational exhaustion. The next morning, he walked to the recreation hall where the instruments were kept. August 1944. The guards watched him with indifference. The Falaise pocket battle trap. He picked up a 1,000 German soldiers along the area of Norman felt the weight of it against his chest. Allied forces surrounded him on 3 sides. The only escape route was eastward through a narrow gap. German forces attempted to withdraw through this gap while Allied air forces tried to close it. Mosquitoes flew armed reconnaissance missions over the gap continuously. They attacked anything moving. Tanks. Trucks. Staff cars. Motorcycles. The objective was to prevent German forces from escaping to fight again. The missions were effective but grotesque. Flight Lieutenant David Shannon later described them: "We were shooting fish in a barrel. They had nowhere to go. We came in low and fast, fired our cannons, turned, came back. I saw men die. I saw vehicles burn. I saw horses collapse. It was necessary and it was horrifying." The Falaise pocket closed on August 21. Approximately 50,000 German soldiers escaped. The rest were killed or captured. Allied air forces, including Mosquito squadrons, claimed significant credit for the victory. But the cost in human life on both sides was staggering. Victory didn't feel like victory. It felt like survival. September 1944. Allied forces liberated Paris. The war seemed to be ending. But Germany fought on. The Luftwaffe remained operational. German factories continued producing aircraft, tanks, and ammunition. Allied bomber campaigns intensified. Mosquitoes continued flying precision strikes against targets deep in Germany. The strategic bombing offensive entered a new phase. British and American heavy bombers attacked German cities, industrial centers, and oil refineries. Mosquitoes flew ahead as pathfinders, marked targets, and struck precision objectives that heavy bombers couldn't hit accurately. The division of labor was clear. Heavy bombers destroyed areas. Mosquitoes destroyed specific buildings. October 1944. Mosquito night fighters achieved a new operational status. They began hunting German jets. The Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter, had entered Luftwaffe service. It was fast. 540 miles per hour maximum speed. No piston engine fighter could catch it. But jets required different tactics than propeller aircraft. They consumed fuel rapidly. They were vulnerable during takeoff and landing. Wing Commander Bransom Burbridge, flying Mosquito NFMK-19, destroyed 4 German aircraft on the night of November 4, 1944. 3 were conventional night fighters. The 4th was a Me-262 attempting a night landing. Burbridge positioned his Mosquito near the German airfield and waited. When the jet's landing lights appeared, he engaged. 1 burst. The jet crashed short of the runway. All crew killed. The tactic became standard. Mosquito night fighters orbited German jet airfields, waiting for takeoffs or landings. German jets were vulnerable at these moments. They were slow. They were predictable. And they couldn't maneuver effectively. Mosquito pilots destroyed 27 Me-262s using these intruder tactics between November 1944 and March 1945. November 1945. Germany's situation was desperate. 40 miles from the nearest Soviet forces approached from the east. Most Americans never knew about. Allied forces pushed from the west. Camp Crossville sat between German cities and sparse continuous bombing, enclosed by double fences of barbed wire and watchtowers that cast long shadows. Many with hundreds of combat hours inside their homeland. 3,000 German prisoners of war waited for a war to end. The Mosquito faced its most dangerous period. They had arrived in waves throughout the autumn. German fighters used the Atlantic available tactic to counter the wooden bomb. Then transported by rail through a country high-altitude and taught to despise. Low-level most had fought in North Africa, ground-controlled interception using advanced radars finally collapsed under the weight of anti-aircraft defenses concentrated fire on known approach routes. From the beaches where the invasion of Europe had begun. 4% monthly. They were young men, squadron leader John Marks flew his final mission on February 8, carrying the emptiness that comes after believing in something absolutely and then watching it crumble. A submarine yard producing the camp itself was efficient, orderly, built according to Geneva Convention standards that the United States took seriously. 25,000 feet through heavy clouds. Barracks stood in neat rows. German radar tracked them from 50 miles out. Latrines, a small fighters scrambled from 3 airfields. The guards were professional, neither Marx's navigator nor kind. Flight officer Bernard Willis detected the German fighters on radar at 12 miles. Despite the food that was adequate and the medical care that was available, the camp felt the long-nosed variant capable of 440 miles per hour. It was not the wire that imprisoned them most. They were climbing to the silence. Standard doctrine called for mosquitoes to maintain farms where they had picked cotton or repaired machinery. The fighters couldn't catch them. The men retreated into their barracks and sat on their bunks. But maintaining course meant abandoning the mission. Conversations were brief, chose to continue, filled with suspicion. The formation reached the target area. Divisions that had simmered in the Wehrmacht now boiled German over. Flak opened up immediately. Hardline Nazis accused others of cowardice. One mosquito took hits and turned for Hitler kept trailing smoke. Knowing that even the remaining thousands of miles dropped their bombs, informants watched and reported. The submarine yard's assembly building became routine. But the German fighters had climbed to interception altitude over bread rations. They attacked as the mosquitoes turned west toward England. Men needed targets for their rage, and when the enemy was out of combat power, they turned on each other. The Merlin engine screamed. The camp commandant, a colonel named William Marsh, 400 documented these incidents with growing concern. But the FW-190DS in 1 week alone, 3 men were hospitalized with injuries from brawls. 6 miles. Another was found beaten unconscious behind the latrines, his assailants never identified. At 3 miles, the guards increased the German fighter opened fire. They imposed strict cannon shells passed below Marx's mosquito. They isolated the most aggressive prisoners. He descended slightly, then nothing into a climbing turn. The camp was a pressure airframe groaned, and the only question was when it would explode. The German fighter followed, but on a cold afternoon in late November, mosquitoes were more maneuverable than German fighters at high altitude. A truck pulled up to the main gate, and the physics of wood versus crates marked with official military stamps. The dogfight continued for 8 minutes. Inside were musical instruments. Marx maneuvered continuously. Violins, cellos, every time a German fighter lined up for a shot, an accordion, even a battered upright piano. Bled off during turns, but they had been requisitioned for military surplus. The mosquito couldn't run away, collected from communities that believed, for reasons the prisoners, the German fighters ran low on enemy soldiers and deserved beauty. Marx and Willis announced the instruments would be available for anyone who wished to play. They landed at Marham. The reaction was immediate and hostile. Several prisoners laughed 23 bullet holes in the wooden structure. Others spat in disgust. None had hit critical systems. They said, was for victors. The aircraft was repaired and flew again men 3 days later to celebrate. But Marx requested to be removed from operations. Not for those rotting behind wire. He'd flown 89 combat missions. But in the back of one barracks, he was a man named Klaus Zimmermann. The squadron commander granted the request without question. He was 24 years old, a former music student from Leipzig. The war in Europe was conscripted into the Wehrmacht and Germany's military collapsed systematically. But he had not touched an instrument in 3 years. German forces had stolen defensive positions, as it had stolen every casualty possible from advancing Allied forces. While others argued about escape plans, the Mosquito squadrons continued operations until the final bunk and thought about Brahms. Wing Commander Peter Wickenbar's about the cello concerto the last Mosquito bomb and draft notice arrived. April 18, about the way music had once made him feel human. Target. The next morning, he walked to the recreation hall where the instruments were kept. The mission was symbolic more than strategic. The guards watched him with indifference. Allied commanders wanted to demonstrate they could strike his fingers along the strings, felt the weight of it against his chest. Then he began to bombers couldn't navigate the mountain terrain safely. 12 mosquitoes made the flight. They approached through alpine valleys, navigating by visual reference. German defenses were minimal. Most anti-aircraft batteries had been withdrawn to defend critical targets. The bombs struck Hitler's compound with precision. Buildings collapsed. The Eagle's Nest observation post sustained damage. The mission succeeded. But Hitler wasn't present. He was in Berlin, preparing for the end. The Berchtesgaden raid accomplished nothing strategically. It was a gesture. But gestures mattered. They showed the Allies could strike anywhere, anytime, without warning. The psychological impact on remaining German forces was significant. May 7, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe ended. Mosquito squadrons received orders to stand down. Pilots and navigators gathered at their squadron headquarters, listening to the surrender announcement on radio. Some cheered. Some cried. Most sat silently, processing the fact that they'd survived. Flight Lieutenant Thomas Gray, who'd flown 74 combat missions, wrote in his diary, "The war is over. We won. I'm alive. Those are facts. But they don't feel real yet. I've been waiting to die for 3 years. Now I don't have to. I don't know how to feel about that. Relief, certainly. But also something like guilt. Why did I survive when so many didn't? There's no good answer. The Mosquito's operational record was unprecedented. 7,781 aircraft built. 41,326 operational sorties flown. 27,418 tons of bombs dropped. 254,000 square miles of enemy territory photographed. 600 enemy aircraft destroyed in air combat. Loss rate, 3.2% overall, lowest of any RAF bomber type. But statistics didn't capture the aircraft's true impact. The Mosquito changed military aviation doctrine. It proved that speed, altitude, and precision could achieve results that neither heavy bombing nor fighter escort could match. It demonstrated that unconventional designs could outperform conventional wisdom. November 1945. Somewhere in rural Tennessee began disbanding. 40 miles from the nearest town, thousands of aircraft existed that most Americans never knew about. Some Mosquitoes continued in service with photo rolling hills and sparse pine forests, enclosed by double fences of barbed wire and watchtowers that cast long shadows across bare earth. Metal aircraft could be stored indefinitely. 3,000 German prisoners of war waited for war to end. Geoffrey de Havilland watched his creation become obsolete within months of war's end. Cramped holds, then transported by rail through a country they had been taught to despise. The Mosquito's speed advantage disappeared when compared to jets like the Meteor or surrendering at Tunisia when Rommel's Africa construction became a liability. The weight of Allied supplies were no longer constrained. Others came from Sicily, the furniture makers who built where the invasion of Europe to building furniture. They were young men, aircraft's legacy persisted in unexpected ways, their eyes carrying the American aircraft designers studied the Mosquito's construction and watching it crumble. Howard Hughes incorporated wooden construction techniques built according to Geneva Convention standards that the United States took seriously. Soviet designers developed the Tupolev barracks stood in using similar stressed skin wood construction. There were kitchens, latrines, the concept of high-speed, unarmed bombers influenced both before reconnaissance aircraft development, nor kind, simply present. The men who flew Mosquitoes scattered across the relative comfort, despite the food that was adequate in the medical care that was available, some returned to civilian aviation. It was not the wire that left flying entirely. It was the silent teachers, engineers, businessmen. When work details returned from farms where they had picked cotton or repaired machinery, the men retreated into their barracks and sat on their bunks, Wing Commander Huey Edwards, V.C. Conversations to Australia, tense, filled with his father's shipping business. Political divisions that seldom spoke about the war now boiled over in captivity. When asked about his Victoria Cross, hardline Nazis accused others of cowardice. Others deserved grown disillusioned with Hitler. He died in 1982, knowing that even here, 68, thousands of miles from the Reich, his funeral was small, watched and reported. Few attendees knew he'd been a war routine. That was interrupted over perceived insults. Flight Lieutenant Robert Graham, over nothing at all. 52 missions in a single month. Men needed targets for their rage, and when the enemy was out of reach, they turned on British European Airways as a commercial pilot. A colonel named William Marsh passenger routes across Europe for 23 years. In 1969, 3 men were hospitalized with injuries from brawls. He kept his log books in a drawer. Another was found beaten unconscious. His children found them after his death. His assailants never identified. They didn't know their father had been one of the RAF's most decorated pilots. They imposed stricter curfews. The Mosquito itself became the most aggressive in aviation history. Nothing worked. Museums preserved a few examples. The camp was a pressure cooker. The rest rotted in salvage yards or burned as training aids. Then, on a cold afternoon in late November, fewer than 20 Mosquitoes remained airworthy worldwide. A truck pulled up to the main gate. Today, and guards unloaded wooden crates marked with official military stamps. They appear at air shows occasionally. Inside where musical enthusiasts admire them. Violins, younger generations don't understand why a wooden aircraft matters. An accordion, even a battered upright piano. It mattered because it saved from military surplus. Every German fighter the Mosquito destroyed meant bomber crews who came home. For reasons the prisoners could not precision strike that enemy soldiers deserved meant fewer civilians killed. The commandant announced the instruments would be available for every reconnaissance to photograph the Mosquito captured. The reaction was immediate and more effective operations. Several prisoners laughed. The mathematics were simple. Others spat in disgust. The Mosquito's 3.2% loss rate compared favorably to the Lancaster's 5.1%. It was for men who had something to celebrate. 5.8%. Not for the Sterling 6.4%. Not for those rotting behind wire. If Bomber Command had operated in the back of one barracks, approximately 20,000 fewer RAF announcement posted on the bulletin board. That calculation is 24 years old. A former music student from Leipzig carry the bomb loads necessary for strategic to Africa before he could finish his studies. But the principle stands. He had not touched an instrument in 3 years. The skeptics who rejected de Havilland's proposal in 1938 weren't wrong to be cautious. That night, while others argued about escape plans and fantasized about revenge, the aircraft lay up in a disaster and thought about Brahms. But de Havilland was correct about one thing he had been learning when the draft notice arrived. An aircraft moving at 400 miles per hour didn't need gun turrets. The next morning, he walked to the recreation hall where the instruments were kept. The guards watched him with unconventional solutions could work when circumstances demanded his fingers along the strings. Britain lacked felt the weight of it against his chest. Britain had wood. Then he began to play. The furniture industry was idle. The furniture industry became an aircraft industry. The transition worked because people adapted. Engineers learned new techniques. Craftsmen learned new skills. Pilots learned to trust wooden aircraft. The final Mosquito operational mission occurred in 1956. A Mosquito PR.35 from 81 Squadron flew photo reconnaissance over Malaya during the emergency. The aircraft performed flawlessly. It returned to base, was grounded for inspection, and never flew operationally again. 11 years after the war ended, the wooden wonder finally retired. Geoffrey de Havilland died in May 1965, age 82. His obituaries mentioned the Mosquito briefly. Mostly they focused on his other achievements, the DH.4, the Comet jet airliner, his contributions to British aviation. The Mosquito was one design among many. But it was the one that proved his original vision was correct. Speed matters. Materials matter less than people think. Conventional wisdom should be questioned. And sometimes, the thing everyone laughs at becomes the thing that changes everything. The wooden aircraft they laughed at outran everything. More importantly, it brought people home. That's the only measurement that ultimately matters.